Hello again. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. Professor John Swinton has probably one of the longest titles. I don't know how it fits on his business card. Professor in Practical Theology and Pastoral Care and Chair in Divinity and Religious Studies at the University of Aberdeen. He also founded the university's Centre for Ministry Studies. I first met John when he wrote this book, Living in the Memories of God, about dementia. And it was a book that challenged me in many ways, but it also challenged me to get to know John and John's work. And it was a great privilege over the latter part of last year and the early part of this year that John came to work with us to understand what it meant to be present with people in the later stages of dementia. One of those conversations was very much about where love sits in all of that. And so we're delighted that John's going to help us understand that and share with us his thoughts on love in the time of dementia. Welcome, John.
Yeah, thank you, Colm. That's a very kind introduction. And good evening or good morning to everybody. It's morning here in Scotland. The sun's just coming up and life's about to begin again. So first of all, it's nice to be here and to be able to speak to you about some stuff that I hope will be interesting. But also I'd like to welcome you to my office. So I think technically I should have had a screen not unlike Colm's, but when I put it up on my computer, my ears disappeared. And it's very disconcerting when you're looking at yourself and your ears disappear. So I thought it'd be more interesting to let you see my office. So behind me here is my recording studio, where I write songs and where I'm creative in life. And that's the kind of like the real part of the office. And then down here is the kind of more academic, contemplative places where I speak to people like you all in some ways. So that's my office. So anytime if anybody ever emails me or speaks to me, that's the context I'll be in. First of all, I just want to outline to you what I want to do. And I want us to think this morning, or this evening as it is, about love in the time of dementia. And I want us to think about love because sometimes people consider love to be quite a risky word, a difficult word. But more than that, love is the one thing that it seems to me that everybody desires: to be loved, to be cared for, to be something special to someone at particular moments in time. And yet oftentimes when we think about dementia, and sometimes when we think about dementia care, we don't automatically go to the language of love. And sometimes there's a good reason for that, but I want to suggest that actually we need to reclaim that language. Now, of course, it's complicated because love is complicated. But simply because something is complicated doesn't mean to say it's not important. And sometimes it indicates just how important something is. Michael Verdi has a lovely new video out called Love is Listening. And it's all about how to overcome dementia, loneliness in the lives of people with dementia. And right at the beginning of that video, he has an interview between Naomi Frail and this lady here in this picture. And this lady here in this picture has advanced dementia, and she's talking about her experience. And she says something like this. She says, "I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm going." And she looks up. Then she looks down, and then she looks at Naomi Frail and says, "But I see your face, and your face is a picture of love." And it's a very, very beautiful scene. But it just struck me when I watched that. When people with and without dementia look at us and look at our faces, do they see a picture of love? Or do they see a picture of fear? Or do they see a picture of somebody who's anxious to go on with the next task? But that idea of looking at one another and seeing love, I think is really important. And that's what I want to push into today. But in order to do that, we need to think carefully about what we mean by love. So I'm not talking here about romantic love, the kind of love that you'd have with your wife or your husband or your boyfriend or your girlfriend. Well, hopefully you won't have all four, but you get what I mean. It's a different kind of love. So this is the way I want us to think about love today. Love is adopting an attitude wherein you look at one another, you value their existence, and you're genuinely glad that they are with you. Okay, so it's a way of looking at somebody that you just appreciate them. You're glad that you're with them. But in order to look in that way and to be glad that you're with people, you need to be functioning in a very particular way. And it strikes me, when I looked at Paul's outline in Corinthians of what love is, I mean, whether you're religious or not religious, it doesn't really matter at this point. The point is that the way that love is laid out here is really, really interesting. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. And if you think about that in the context of the kind of care that you like to encounter when you begin your journey and go through your journey into dementia, that's exactly the way that you want people to treat you. Gently, patiently, kindly, with humility. So there's something very powerful about that. And the question is, how do we get that into our practices in a way that is peaceful and non-abusive? So we go through lots and different phases of love in our lives. So, you know, parental love, the love you get from your mum and dad, or the love that you get to your kids. Familial love, the way you love your family. Then romantic love, when you fall in love with somebody. And then eventually you get married. And marriage shifts and changes over time into companionship. And then right at the end of your life, you have professional love in that sense. But all of these different dimensions of love that run all the way through our lives all have basically the same rhythm, whereby we look at other people and say, look, I'm really glad that you're here. I appreciate you, and I want to spend time with you. I value you. And so no matter where you are on that life journey, love is fundamentally important for your growth, for your health, for your well-being, for your spirituality, for your sense of peacefulness and goodness about being in the world. And we're going to look at specifically at professional love in a few moments. But for now, let's think about some of the tensions in that, because the dementia journey is tricky. So it's to do, sometimes we forget ourselves, we no longer know who we are in that sense, but at the same time, we rediscover ourselves. If we're given the right conditions, given the right relationships, yes, we forget things, but we rediscover other things. We lose our old loves, but we find new loves. And sometimes our new loves are actually our old loves in a slightly different form. We lose old friends, but we encounter new friends. And sometimes these new friends are our old friends in a slightly different form. We just need to be patient and kind so that we can understand that. Forgetting our loved ones, but at the same time being with our loved ones in new ways. So there's a tension in the journey of love in the context of dementia. That's certainly the case, but it's a challenge. It's not a problem, because if we frame it properly, there's always a possibility of moving to a positive, even in the midst of a negative. So the outrage is the outrage of lovelessness. Love is a fundamental human need that we often fail adequately to consider in relation to the care and support of people living with dementia and their families. You know, you hear it in the language people use, oh, she's no longer the person she used to be, or she'd never behaved like that, or I like to remember the person they used to be. It's like we forget people because they're forgetful. And very rarely do you hear the language of love and positiveness in the context of dementia. I think it's outrageous that we may implicitly or explicitly have a group of people within us that we somehow think, well, maybe love's different, or maybe we don't think love is appropriate. Love's fully appropriate. So that's the outrage I speak into. And the problem with, I think, with dementia, like many other conditions that relate to your brain, is stigma. You know, stigma emerged from the Greek slave trade, where a slaver would buy a person and put a mark on them. And then immediately when they had that mark on them, they were reduced to the size of that mark. They were no longer a person, no longer a human being, simply that mark. And that's the way that stigma work uses. Dementia can do that. As soon as you have a diagnosis of dementia, people just begin to make assumptions about you, and they're very often negative assumptions. And stigma is really dangerous. I spoke to a woman, or visited a woman not so long ago, who had been very religious woman, very much involved with her church. And over time, she had come to live with dementia, and she ended up in a care home. And all her life, she'd been really involved with this religious community over here. As soon as she went to the care home, nobody bothered to visit her. Nobody came. So the same group of people that welcomed her, in the end, rejected her, not because they were being unpleasant, but just because they assumed certain things about the diagnosis of dementia. One being that this person no longer really enjoyed relationships, enjoyed love, enjoyed being with them. So love is the opposite of stigma, and the exact opposite of the dehumanizing attitudes that often pervade our culture and sometimes our caring practices. Dehumanizing attitudes are assumptions, implicit or explicit, that somebody before you isn't really worth it, isn't really to be valued, isn't really going to appreciate the things that you and I do. That's what stigma does. It distorts your mind. It makes you think that other people don't experience the things that you do, and it gives you an arrogance in that sense. But love gives you a humility. It helps you to slow down and look at people. So the question then is it possible to care without love? And the answer to that question is probably is. You think about it. If you're lying in a hospital bed, right, and a nurse comes in and she's engaging in really caring practices with you, she's keeping you warm, clean, really looking after your wound or whatever it is that you're in hospital for. And then for whatever reason, you suddenly discover that she's only doing it because she's a professional. She's only doing it because she gets paid for it. Nothing changes. Your care is still fantastic, but everything changes because the relational context within which you're receiving that care is completely different. And you realize that she's not really understanding what's going on with me. She doesn't understand my story. She doesn't understand what I want. She doesn't understand these other dimensions. I'm grateful for what she's doing to me here, but there's something missing. And I'll come back to in a few minutes as to why we sometimes can get into that situation. So you can care without love. You can't love without caring. You can't look at somebody and say, oh, I'm really glad that you exist. I really value your life, and not care for them. So you can care without love, but you can't love without care. Now, just a reminder at this point of what I mean by love, because I think it's important that we're keeping it to a narrow definition, if you like. So love is adopting an attitude wherein you look at other people, you value their existence, and you're genuinely glad that they are with you. So that when I talk about love, that's the attitude that I'm talking about. And then all these other things, patience, kindness, and so on, are how you develop that attitude. But of course, love is something that we have to practice. So love is a verb. It's something that we do with our bodies. Now, how do we go about practicing love? How do we become people who are caring and notice people and value them in that sense? Well, we do that in some kind of community. And all kinds of community have a culture. But basically, a culture means what we do around here. It's the way you think, the way you act, the way you interact with things. So if you think about an organization, all organizations have a culture. They have ways of doing things that are acceptable, things that are not acceptable, things that are assumed norms, and things that are not assumed, and implicit and explicit stuff. Now, your culture is fundamentally important because it shapes your perception. It shapes the way that you see the world. And the way that you see the world, or think you see the world, will determine the way that you respond to the things that you see in the world. So if you think that your job is simply to engage in a series of tasks to make sure a person is kept warm and healthy and safe, then that's probably the way you'll see things. And perception relates deeply to behavior, because the way that you behave is determined what you perceive. So if you perceive the person before you as being somebody who's valuable, somebody who you care for, somebody who you really want to be with, that's what you'll see, and that's how you'll behave. And that will impact upon your personality, although your personality is more complicated because you get that from all sorts of places. But institutional structures or organizational structures will either shape these people's perceptions in positive, loving ways or not. So you're always going to have a culture, you're always going to have a spirit within the organization. The question is whether or not that is a positive influence or a negative influence. And let me give you an example. So a few years ago, 3 years ago, I think it was, Aberdeen City Council, I live in Aberdeen, Scotland. Aberdeen City Council asked me, commissioned me to do a kind of exploration of dementia services within the city. They were looking for creative ways to bring families and people with dementia into community. Because they were bringing together the healthcare service and the social care service, and this was a good opportunity. And it was an interesting project. But one of the things that I noticed early on is that for some services in this area, they're commissioned on the basis of quality of care. And so all the money that comes from the government goes into quality of care and is assessed by quality of care. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, everybody needs good quality of care. We need to be safe and warm, and we need to have certain things to enable us simply to survive, but to survive well. But within the documentation and within the commissioning process, quality of life wasn't a part of it. So you had organizations which were great at quality of care, but for whom quality of life was an option. So you can maybe help people to have a better quality of life by taking them to places, by helping them to develop certain relationships, by doing various social things, but it's not compulsory, and you're not assessed by that. Now, that strikes me as very important, because if an organization is missing out on that fundamental dimension of quality of care, quality of life, which is kind of where love lives, then you can be a very good care organization, you can provide fantastic care, but you actually miss out on certain things that are fundamental to what it means to be a human being and to live well in the midst of dementia. And it's that idea of living well in the midst of dementia, I think, is sometimes overlooked, but is really important. I spent quite a lot of time recently, or have spent quite a lot of time recently, working in the area or researching in the area of mental health. And one of the many things that I found fascinating about that is the development of the recovery model. The recovery model is a model of understanding developed by service users, developed by people who are using services. So recovery within medicine would be to overcome your symptoms through medication or through therapy or whatever it is, so that you can no longer have this particular condition or no longer have this set of experiences. But the recovery model, as it's been developed by service users, says that to recover from something like schizophrenia, for example, is to be able to make the best of your life, even in the midst of the complexities of the experience that you have as you encounter voices and you have the confusion that sometimes goes with schizophrenia. And so it's a very different model of recovery. And I think if we take that kind of understanding into the context of dementia, then interesting things begin to happen. So what does it mean to recover from dementia, even though you know that that journey is always going to be difficult and always going to be a series of losses as you move along, and yet at the same time to recover, to be able to live as well as possible, even within the difficulties and the changes that you're going through. I think that recovery mentality is fundamentally important. And love requires us to rethink our understanding of recovery. Love, to love the person before us, as in, I really want to value you, I really want you to I'm really glad that you're with me in this context, requires that not you're always looking at somebody as if they're ill, or looking at somebody as if they're going to decline, but looking at what does it mean for you to recover at this moment in time? What structures do I need to create within my organization to enable you to recover at this moment in time? What do I have to do to enable you to recover at this moment in time? I think love allows us to make that subtle but important shift into recovery mode, if you like, wherein which a positive, possible new future for people, no matter where they are on their dementia journey, becomes a possibility. But you have to see that. And in order to see that, you need to slow down. And slowing down is a complicated thing. So if you're going to be gentle and kind and patient and humble, you need to have structures within your organization or structures within your home or wherever you are that enable that. In other words, it's interesting. Some of the research that we do with people living in care homes, for example, we'll go in and we'll talk about spiritual things. We'll talk about spirituality, and we'll say to people, how important do you think spirituality is for people with dementia? And people say, so it's really important. People need meaning and purpose and hope, and they need to know who they are in the world. But unfortunately, we don't have time to do that. I think some people just said to me that, it's an essential aspect of being a human being. And it seems that we don't have time to do an essential aspect of what it means to be a human being. So in order for good quality, loving care to occur, we need to have structures in place that give people the time and the space to be able to do it. So good spiritual care in that sense is a management issue, as well as you and me sitting down and talking about good things with people. And I think the last time I spoke at the Having Care conference, I used this as an illustration, but I shamelessly use it again. There's a Japanese theologian called Kusaka Kiyama, who years ago wrote a book called The 3 Mile an Hour of God. And he notices that the average speed that a human being walks at is 3 miles an hour. And so he says, Jesus, who was a human being, walked at 3 miles an hour. Jesus, who is God, who is love, walks at 3 miles an hour. In other words, he says, love has a speed. It's a spiritual speed. It's a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed. It goes on in the depths of our life, whether we notice it or not, at 3 miles an hour. It's the speed we walk, and therefore the speed the love of God walks. I really like that. Behind me there, up in the wall, that says speed limit 3 miles an hour. So at least at my office, the speed limit's 3 miles an hour. But slowing down enables us to love, enables us to see things, enables people to recover in that sense. And slowing down breaks down loneliness. Now, dementia can be a very lonely place sometimes, not simply because of the changes that go on, but for other reasons that are equally as important. As Colin said in the introduction to this talk, I had the real pleasure of spending 8.5 months working with Hammond Care, which was great. Working on the issue of presence. What does it mean to be present with people who communicate differently? With people with advanced dementia, for example. And it's one of the things that the organisation was sensitive to was that sometimes it was possible to be present with somebody physically, but actually for care workers not really to be engaging. So people may be looking away, or they may be looking on their phones and so on and so forth. So you're present, but not necessarily present. And it's a communicational issue. But one of the things that struck me as I got into that research was how our culture in general is more and more becoming a culture of absence. You know, in the good old days where here, you could sit in restaurants, you probably still can sit in restaurants where you are now, but you see 4 or 5 people sitting around a table, everybody on their phone, doing their thing, everybody talking to somebody in, I don't know, Venezuela, and another person speaking to somebody in Spain or wherever it is. So you're present but absent, and social media does that. It gets us used to being absent, even though we're present. And so it strikes me, if you have a culture of absence, within society, and then you take that into a care facility situation, then you have all sorts of difficulties. Not because people are necessarily want to be mean or unpleasant. If you're absent, you don't notice things. If you're absent, you can find yourself drawn into practices that are loveless, even though you may not deliberately do that. So look, the work is ongoing, and we're still thinking it through, but it's very important. How can we really enable one another to be present? But putting to one side dementia care, that's a pretty good challenge for society, for all of us. How do we actually come to a situation where we start being present with one another and start noticing one another and start saying, well, I'm glad you're here. How do we develop not only a culture of love, but a natural habitat that is driven by love? All right, so another couple of things that I want us to think about. Love teaches us to wait for things and to wait hopefully for things. There's a really interesting book by an English theologian years ago called The Stature of Waiting. And he looks at the story of Jesus' life, and he points out that people are always waiting around for something. They're waiting for this to happen, that to happen, next to happen. But the key thing that I want you to think about, and us to think about, is in order to wait, you need to wait for something. You know, if we're waiting with people who are living with dementia, what we're waiting for? We must be waiting for something, because if you're just standing around or sitting around doing nothing, you're not waiting for anything. But if you're waiting for something, then you wait for it. And so what love does, it sensitizes us to presence, but it sensitizes to the excitement of presence, that when we're present, we're waiting for something. We're looking for something to happen. We're looking for a new possibility. And so it changes your mindset. You see things differently. And excuse me, I used my elbow. I hope you're impressed. The next thing that I want to think about in terms of waiting is homefulness. Love requires homefulness. Walter Brueggemann talks about homefulness as being belonging with God and belonging with neighbour and community. Your home is the place where you get your identity, your sense of safety, your sense of being loved, your sense of warmth, your sense of neighbourhood. All these things are tied into your home, which is why it's so difficult for elderly people to move out of their home into a completely alien environment. But if we think about homefulness, what does it mean to create a culture of homefulness, where people just feel at home? People just feel that this is who you are. And when I say people, I mean people with dementia and also staff. What does it mean just to feel at home in that sense? And penultimately, just before I begin to move towards the end of what I want to say, is the issue of faith. Now, faith is not for everybody, obviously, but for those whom faith is significant, it becomes very, very important. Because it's tied in with faith, how you're loved by a community, how you're loved by God. And when you're going through the changes in dementia, that is important to feel that love. But faith and love in the time of COVID is really interesting. I mean, from what I gather, most of Australia anyway seems to be coping well with the COVID epidemic, but here it's just terrible across Europe, and it's just getting worse. At the end of this day, today, we're going to be told what our latest lockdown restrictions are, and I suspect they'll be quite heavy. But one of the side effects of the virus doesn't get a lot of publicity, at least not here, is the impact it has on elderly people, and the impact it has on people with dementia, and the impact it has on love within the context of dementia. And to illustrate this, I'm just going to give this story. I'm not even going to talk to it, but I'm going to give you a story because it makes the point. One of my PhD students, she's in Switzerland, she's looking at consolation at end-of-life care. So it's looking at the things that help people to feel better, to be consoled at the end of life care. And there's a section in her research looking specifically at COVID. And this story, I thought, would help us to get that connection between the significance of faith for some people and the damage that COVID is doing. Alexander, who's 89, lives at home with his wife, who has dementia. She's been in a nursing home for 7 months now, just before COVID and the lockdown started. He was able to look after her, but he is now too weak to do that. He has 2 daughters, one of them is blind. I miss my wife, he says, every day, and I pray that she can die soon. Before lockdown, I visited her 3 to 4 times a week, and she knew my name. She gave me a kiss and enjoyed being with me and her daughters. Then lockdown came. I tried to phone as often as I could, but it was difficult. Often she was too sad to speak. I felt she's missing me. It made me sad and I cried a lot. I started to wake up at night and prayed that this will change and that we can see and feel each other again soon. After 10 weeks, I was able to see her again, but she couldn't say my name anymore. I tried to sing with her. She could sing the church hymns, My Heart, but she didn't respond. It was unbearable, and my daughters encouraged me not to go too often. It depressed me so much, and I felt that I was losing my strength. I feel much weaker than a few months ago. I read my daily light every day, but my only comfort is now that both our weaknesses lies in the hands of God, and I hope that we can both die soon. It's a hard time. One of the powerful impacts of COVID is that it isolates people who are already isolated. One of the powerful things about faith is it begins to mend some of that. At least it does for this couple. But I'll leave you to think about that story, because there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do, and it's loving work that we're going to have to do once lockdown begins to move on and once life begins to open up again. There are casualties of the virus that are well beyond the obvious. All right, just to finish off what I'm going to say to you. Obviously, there are dangers in using the language of love, and obviously there are dangers about some of the ways that love can frame things. So professional boundaries are really, really important. They protect people, and particularly vulnerable people. So I'm not in any sense pushing against professional boundaries. Quite the opposite. I'm suggesting that we think about love in the context of professional boundaries. Likewise, for risk, it's a risky business, as the previous conference talked about. However, risk is necessary for growth. It's how we manage risk, not the presence of risk that's important. Expectations, if we begin to think about a culture of love, are we able to meet the expectations that we'll do? Dependency and fear, because it's a kind of, there's an uncomfortableness, a distance about using this kind of language, which can easily move into fear. But fear is simply an uncertainty about the future. It's not a necessity. And all of these things are challenges, not barriers. The challenges that we need to take very, very seriously, but they're not barriers. Because when we think about the nature of love, love never gives up. Love never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. How could we possibly exclude that from our attitudes, from our friendships, from our caring practices? Yes, we have to be careful. Yes, we need professional boundaries. But surely that's simply a challenge to take us to a place where love will win, and where the possibility of love, which is what we all want in the end, becomes a reality. And more than that, becomes a normality in the way that we look at one another and the way that we engage with one another. Well, thank you for listening. I'll hand you back to Colm.
Thank you, John. I do have a few questions for you, so I'll let you get a drink of water if you need. I suppose it's very interesting how you finished off there, because if I was just reflecting even on the theme of the conference and my own anxieties, you know, we called this conference Care in an Age of Outrage, and I talked about at the start of the conference my anxiety, the outrage can often stand out and sometimes drown out the great stuff that is happening. And I guess you're challenging us to stay hope in the middle of all of that and not let it drown out things. One of the things that has been asked is that you talked about seeing the face of love. Can you really teach someone to have that, to have a face of love?
Well, I think that you can remind people when they don't have, which might not be the same thing. I mean, I think it's well, you know, at least partly it's a matter of learning how to empathize. And empathy is something that people can learn. And so if you're able to, but in order to empathize, you've got to have some kind of understanding about what's going on in front of you. So empathy is an imaginative projection of what you think is happening in front of you, which you then take back into yourself, and then you respond accordingly. Now, if you've got a profoundly negative view of what you think is happening in front of you, then you will empathize, but you will empathize in a way that assumes that what you're seeing is just nothing but negativity. Mm-hmm. So I think what you can do is you can teach people how to empathize, because empathy is a learned skill. But you can also help people to recognize dementia in a positive, constructive, and creative way, so that when they look at the other person and empathize in that way, they're doing so hopefully. And if you're looking at somebody hopefully and looking for the possibility of creative change or creative presence, then your face will reflect that, as will your body language.
And I suppose you're also saying it's up to all of us, because if your face isn't reflecting that, you would hope that your colleagues are part of that conversation.
Well, exactly. If you've got a miserable face all day long, somebody should tell you about it. Nothing personal, Colin.
Never with you. In Australia, we obviously have our care standards. You talked about boundaries, and the question is about consumer choices. So how does love fit with professional boundaries when we're asking about spiritual care? Do we risk overstepping these boundaries if someone doesn't want to discuss these choices? Is it important to address love?
Well, I mean, I think that love, it depends whether you think love is a matter of formation, or whether I'll come back to this question. Whether you think love is a matter of formation or a matter of competencies. So if it's a matter of formation, that you can form yourself so that these kind of ways of being in the world are part of the culture of your organization or the culture of the place you are, then over time that becomes just the way that people behave, right? If love is a series of competencies that you have to learn, then you get a slightly different thing there, because you have a kind of a formal structure that everybody has to adhere to, within which certain questions have to be asked and certain questions shouldn't be asked. So I think there's an educational issue around formation and competency. In relation to the person that you're dealing with, they should always have the opportunity for you not to make choices for them. People should always have choices for themselves. But my point would be that it's not simply a matter of asking people questions. So what I'm suggesting is it's a matter of the formation of the carer, who then approaches an individual with, if you like, a loving attitude, within which autonomy and freedom is fundamentally important for a person to be able to make the right kinds of choices. Because love is not something that you enforce upon somebody. It's something that is actually intended for the benefit of the other person, not for the benefit of you in that sense. So I think when it comes to autonomy of choice and freedom, it's a good way of enabling people to find that, achieve that.
John, one of the other things that's been raised and you've touched on is how in this current time are people meant to support and deal with grief when people with dementia are dying in care homes Currently, it seems care homes don't allow for this, and staff go through some emotional trauma and can be reluctant to talk about love and how they can give that when it's hard to, I guess, be able to go through the grieving process in the way perhaps we did in the past. Have you got any reflections on that?
No, I don't mean no, full stop. But I think that's a huge issue. It's a huge issue for staff, but it's also a huge issue for families and friends who, certainly around here, are still not very often not allowed to visit people. So people, not only do people die in care, but they then can't have a funeral. So you haven't seen somebody face to face for months. They die, and then you have a funeral with maybe a few people, but very few. And so there's a huge series of losses. You have the loss that runs up to the fact that the person is no longer in contact with the one you loved. You have a loss when the person actually gets ill and you can't be with them, which is profoundly painful. And then the loss when somebody dies, and then the loss when the family, all of the family, can't necessarily celebrate the funeral, if celebrates the right way to put it. Likewise for carers, and I saw yesterday, I mean, the carers here have had such a traumatic experience in care homes because early on in the pandemic, people were simply being sent from the hospital to straight to the care homes, which meant lots and lots of people died, and it was just extremely painful for them. And I saw last week that the government's suggesting to do the same thing again, so it's not closed in that sense. So I think that I think there's a role in there for the chaplain, the spiritual carer, in any of these organizations, to begin to help people to articulate the complexities of their grief in a way that they can't do on their own, and that way probably other professionals can't do as well. So if you've got a chaplain or a spiritual carer, or even if you don't have that specifically associated with the organization, it's possible to bring people in from outside to give an objective perspective on things, and just to give people a space to talk. Because in that context, when you hear yourself talk, actually that's the beginning of healing. So I think there are resources there, but I think that in order to work well with these resources, we need to recognize the enormity of the problem, and it's huge, and it's only just beginning to see in terms of what it's going to look like.
John, I think you've answered this, but I think it's just interesting for you to know some of the questions that are coming through. One of the other ones was, what are the things that we can do for ourselves to ensure that we are able to consistently provide love and replenish ourselves in what is a draining time? But you have obviously talked about the importance of drawing on pastoral care and other things, but any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, but just to looking after your mental health means, I mean, one of the things that came out of the Hammond Care work was the idea of micro breaks. That apparently, if you take a series of micro breaks, which it can only be a minute, 2 minutes during the day, and even in the midst of your kind of more intense periods, it's good for your mental health. It lowers your blood pressure, but also it actually increases your productivity. So, although all of us in different ways probably work in a very intense environment, just taking these little steps back and these little moments of meditation or whatever way you want to fill that micro break is profoundly health bringing, and that might be a beginning point for other things.
And I probably should say you are writing that work up at the moment, so that's stuff that we will get to share, because the next question I'll get is, where's the paper? So right. it's coming from Aberdeen. Have you got any final question is about have you seen any ways that people have overcome the PPE? Obviously the importance of PPE, I'm not suggesting we work around, but it does put a barrier to expressing love in some of the ways. You talked at the very start about being able to see the face, Naomi Feld example, but have you seen other ways that people have been able to express love while other barriers are in the way?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I was coming out of the supermarket the day before yesterday, and there was two women having a conversation in front of me, and one said to the other, you know, I long for the days when we could smile and see one another smile in the supermarket. And she was really sad. But I mean, and my mother, who's 96, she goes to the GP and she can't hear a word because she suddenly realized that she lip reads, and she can't lip read anymore. The only thing I've seen in terms of innovation on that is the plain glass mask that a lot of people use, particularly for people who have hearing impairments, where you can at least see a person's face in that way. So that's probably the most innovative thing. Although one of the interesting things is how you come to read people's eyes. I think that's a new skill that I've learned, is how you can smile through your eyes, and you can actually smile through your eyes. But for somebody living with dementia, it must be extremely off-putting, if not terrifying, to have people walking around with masks on and full PPE. Necessary as it may be, it's difficult. But I think the way that you are with people, your gentleness, your patience, the way that you can, as much as you can, explain what you're doing, you can at least reduce people's anxiety through your bodily presence and the way that you touch people, the way that you are with people. So I think it's far from ideal, but not impossible.
John, you've got all your music behind you there. Now, probably people have been trying to see what's on your shelves. I guess my last question is, what music at the moment helps you feel love?
What music helps me feel love? Well, I play the guitar, and I find that the guitar is a very evocative instrument. So it doesn't help me feel love, but it helps me to feel peace. So I feel the way that you engage with an instrument, any instrument, actually, it becomes almost like an extension of yourself, because you articulate your emotions through it. So if I'm really sad, my guitar can speak for me. If I'm really anxious, my guitar can speak that out for me, even if I don't necessarily have the words for it. So I see it as a way of, I don't know, capturing and articulating my emotions. So playing would be the answer to your question. Or I like singing as well. But whether anybody else likes that is another question.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do.
Yeah.
John, as always, I cannot thank you enough, because it is hard times. You know, people's resilience is stretched. But for you to shine a light on hope and love is really important to us. And I thank you for being our concluding speaker today. Please give our best to all your family. And we look forward to the work in drawing together what you've done on presence, because I know people will be asking us about when we'll hear about that.
Right.
But for now, thanks very much.
No, thank you, Colin.
Now, from John in Aberdeen, and I know we have people coming online just now from elsewhere, and I know, for example, the Life Changes Trust in Scotland are one of a number of organisations who actually seem to have stayed up all night watching the conference. But for countries that are just coming online, you'll be pleased to know about the next part of our journey as a conference.